So I'm going to talk a little bit about the more technical aspects of WISPs and how we can improve our security posture organizationally. So really this is kind of a rundown of the different areas I'm going to talk about. And all of these play a role to some extent in having a good information system plan and procedure, and all to some extent help you meet the terms of the mass law. So this is kind of a quick summary. We'll jump into kind of a background for IT security. So, you know, I'm technical by nature, so I see everything kind of in this prism. These are the three areas that all of your decisions will be taken in and kind of evaluated against. So we call it the CIA Triad. It has nothing to do with the Central Intelligence Agency. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Any decision you make to protect your data and your systems will be a compromise of one of three or possibly all of these values. So if you want to protect the confidentiality of your data and your people, you're likely not to have a very available system. You know, you might isolate it, you might only make it available for a short period of time to protect that data. That might not be acceptable to your business. You know, similarly with integrity, if you're concerned about the integrity of the data itself, the protections you put in place might limit confidentiality, might limit availability. Likewise, if availability is your concern, you need to always be up. You're placing your systems at additional risk because they're 24/7. So confidentiality and integrity may be impacted. So something to think about. Every organization has a different comfort level about where they sort of fall into this triangle. You know, you may lean more towards availability just due to business requirements, or you may lean more towards integrity of data or confidentiality depending on your requirements, you know, from a business and regulatory perspective. The root of any good information security plan starts with data identification and classification. You need to know the types of information you're storing and where you're storing it. You can't do much else if you don't have this process in place. The idea, you know, in the context of the Massachusetts law is to identify all of the locations on your network that you store and process PI. And that could be from an application perspective. You may have an application, depending on your line of business, that processes PI, but you need to know all of the entry and exit points as well. So it's not just the particular server it's on, it's is somebody out in the field with a laptop pulling this information in. You know, if you're in the insurance business, you might have underwriters out, you know, getting this information. Where does it kind of flow through? You need to follow the stream of processing and map out all of these locations. Many organizations don't engineer, especially if you have in-house software development, they don't necessarily engineer with security in mind, which is why I have a job. So you need to evaluate also whether all of those touch points are required. So if you've got 10 or 15 touch points where PII is flowing through, does it need to hit all of those points, or was it just lazy engineering, lazy software development? You know, can you scale that back so that, you know, you really only have, you know, 1 or 2 points that you need to lock down and secure? So something to think about. And then, you know, obviously you need to keep in mind your regulatory requirements, your legal requirements to any classification. Once you've done that, then you can sort of decide the controls that you need to put in place. One of the foundational areas of IT security is logical access, and that's providing you know, the methodology of providing access to your systems and your infrastructure. A good WISP will have requirements spelled out for how you need to create your accounts. They are a little bit vague to leave some room for flexibility, but they do require a secure method of user logon and interaction with your systems. So we interpret that to have a uniquely identifiable approach. So no sharing of accounts. Every person should have a named account, so it can be traced back. We call that non-repudiation. It's basically the ability to assign back, to attribute activity to an individual user. And secure authentication is kind of a complicated topic these days. Gone are the days where you just need a password, as Rob mentioned. We're really in an era where a lot of organizations don't have sufficient password complexity. 6 characters is not enough anymore. 8 characters is not enough anymore. We need to start thinking of more robust, 12+ character passwords. It's a mathematical function, really. The more characters you have in your password, the harder it is to crack. Because you figure, if you allow letters, numbers, and characters, each digit you add is an infinitely, more complex number of possibilities. So we really need to start thinking about increasing these out. A lot of pushback we get is that, if we start going, 12+ characters, we start seeing sticky notes of passwords under keyboards, because how can you remember these passwords? And this is where, if you're finding some pushback, this is where the 2-factor approach can help. So maybe you don't need to expire these passwords every 90 days or every 30 days, but put an additional factor in. Maybe it's the text message to your phone when you try and log in, gives you a 6-digit number. You can punch that in. That gives you a little bit of flexibility of allowing that password not to expire as frequently, and hopefully driving people away. Yeah.
Are there updates as to what's going to be next after passwords because of that exact problem? Like, people have to draw a picture, or there's something evolving there, or are we just stuck with?
Well, there's definitely a lot of innovation in that space, but part of the challenge that organizations have is they have legacy infrastructure that might not be compatible with it. Like, if you look at kind of on the cutting edge right now, there's iris scanners. The Samsung phone that came out last year that ended up being explosive had a really, it was a great idea. It didn't work in practice, but it had an iris scanner built in. Windows 10, I think the newest release, has what they call Windows Hello, which is facial recognition, and it has a method to beat, in the early days, you could just print out a picture of somebody, hold it up to the screen, and it would say, "Oh, I recognize you. Here's your login." But now it can actually measure the depth, so it knows, the distance between your nose and your ear. It kind of has a 3D model, so it beats that, But the problem is a lot of organizations aren't necessarily ready to integrate that.
My Windows phone has iris scanning with facial recognition.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's probably the Windows Hello feature. There's things we can start to do, but thinking practically, you're not going to move the world in a short amount of time. So 2-factor has been around for a long time, and there's a number of different third-party tools and ways that we can integrate it into existing systems fairly easily. So I think that's really where to start. The biggest complaint that I get is we really can't handle any more frequent password expirations, because people are having enough trouble. They've got passwords for everything, and it's like overload. And the easiest thing is, okay, well, make it a little longer, allow people to do words so they can string together 4 or 5 random words that they'll remember, but give them a second factor, so that if somehow somebody was able to guess that, they're not going to have your cell phone, so they're not going to have that extra step to log in. That's a good starting point, I think.
So if you have that second factor where it sends the code to your phone, would you still have to update your password probably twice a year, even if you do have that second factor? Is that still something that you're going to have to do?
We recommend that, yeah. Just in a best case scenario, and we mentioned this earlier, you're not going to use the same password everywhere. That best case. So then if one password's compromised, you're good. But reality is that very few people do that. There are tools out there, password management tools. I'm a 1Password user myself, but there's LastPass and there's other solutions that will help manage that. Very few people use those tools. So we still recommend that you do expire passwords, just because the chances are that it's not only is it your network login, it might be an application login, it might be elsewhere. Just keeping that expiring helps, to protect you. And 2-factor is not foolproof either. There have been cases where hackers have been able to somehow spoof, or there was a case where a user of Apple products was able to, was susceptible to a hack. A hacker had ended up calling Verizon and saying basically that he needed to change over his SIM card, pretending to be this user, plugged it into a different phone, got the text message on, on the hacker's phone. So there are ways that you can still be compromised, but having that second factor is, it's infinitely more safe than just a password. But ultimately, we do recommend that passwords still get expired. Maybe in 10 years from now, when we're talking about biometrics and all these other things, a password will be of lesser importance, and we might not need it to expire as frequently, but we're not there yet. So there's some other steps here too, just locking out accounts. A lot of organizations have these steps in place. You try to log in 3 times, you get locked out. That's just good practice. And then really the last area I wanted to briefly mention is just the principle of least privilege. And that's the idea that you should only be granted access to the absolute minimum of which you need to do your job across the network. And that, should an account be compromised, if you're adhering to a principle of least privilege, the damage ideally will be contained to a small area. Access monitoring and alerting is kind of a new area relatively to the other concepts. This is sort of the thought behind this is on any given day our networks are gathering a lot of disparate data. Logging on the firewall, logging on your servers, your phone's logging, all these disparate sources. And individually, the logs might not tell us very much, but taken together as a whole, aggregated, analyzed, they can actually tell us quite a bit. They can give us sort of a heartbeat of your company's network. They can give you a baseline of what a normal day looks like. And on the flip side of that, it can alert you if something looks abnormal. So if somehow your systems have been compromised, an attacker might be trying to take data out of your network. There might be a gigabyte worth of extra traffic moving through. You might not know if you're looking at individual log files. You might not have alerting set up, but there's a new area of security information and event management that the idea behind that is it's pulling in all of these disparate log files, churning through them, and giving you some sort of kind of real-time alerting on the sort of health of your network and your infrastructure. It's a new-ish area. Most organizations that we deal with are starting to think about it, but don't necessarily have it in place. The few that do are very, very happy with what they're getting out of it. And there's very expensive solutions, and there's also open source solutions in this area. I mean, you pretty much, you can get any capability for any price. So it can go, very expensive to, relatively inexpensive. But it is very effective in giving you kind of a baseline of where your network should be in a normal day, and then you can easily map any aberrations to that. Another area too, this is just good practice. In some cases, if you're subject to Sarbanes-Oxley and some other areas, you have to do this anyway, but that's just access recertification. And the idea is once you've done your data classification approach, you assign data owners to that data and have them, at least annually, look at a list of people who have access to their data and sign off on it. This will help enforce a principle of least privilege. It'll help clean up any misses that your help desk might have in employee transfers or terminations or in that area. And it keeps access relatively clean. You might find that an individual needed access to a particular area of the network or particular application for a limited period of time. That person's, maybe it was a project, the project's over, but typically that person would retain access unless somebody went through and put a ticket into a help desk. So it's a good area to, it's a good exercise to undergo. Encryption is critical. Does everyone know what encryption is before I dive in? Basically, simply put, it's the garbling of data in an intentional way to be unreadable by basically unreadable by anyone who wasn't meant to read it. It's been around for thousands of years. The Romans were fairly good at it for the time. It's gotten quite a bit more complicated lately, as you may imagine. For the purposes of the Massachusetts data privacy law, there are 2 dimensions to it, and that's encryption at rest, meaning data, inactive data stored on a drive, and then data in motion, so data you're sending. Could be an email, could be a file transfer. We need to look at it 2 different ways, and really with 2 types of solutions in mind, just given the nature of it. Full disk encryption is required on mobile devices if they store PI. We recommend, just given the feasibility technically, that you just encrypt all of these devices rather than several that store PI. It's easy enough. Windows has it built in. It's called BitLocker. If you're running Windows 10 Professional, and then I think all flavors of, no, it's Windows 7 Professional, all flavors of Windows 10, it's built in. And it fits very well with domain, if your network infrastructure. So it's free, it's built in. There's other solutions out there that have some bells and whistles that you'd have to pay for. If you have Macs in the environment, Macs actually now ship with encryption enabled by default. So they come out of the box encrypted. And similarly with mobile phones and tablets, all Apple devices, I think for the last 5 years or so, are encrypted out of the gate. Android's a mess, but if you do use Android, some of the more reputable brands like Samsung, LG, and so on are encrypted out of the gate.
Could you break that down a little bit more for me? Like, do you mean, for example, and this is very literal, if I download a file from an email to my laptop, whether someone can get on, or do you just mean generally that it's like access to a laptop, access to a mobile phone is password protected?
Well, it's different than passwords. So when we're talking about encryption, so encryption in transit. So if you're, this specifically refers to
the first type, the non-transit.
Oh, at rest. Yeah. So that would be, say, on the hard drive of your laptop. If you've got, as an example, we're an accounting firm, so if you've got tax returns of clients, so name, social, financial history, so on, the hard drive in your laptop that data is on must be encrypted. It has to have what we call full disk encryption. So not just the file itself, but the entire hard drive needs to be encrypted.
So when would that come up? When would somebody be trying to access
They stole your laptop.
Yeah. So if your laptop was stolen, you can pull the drive out and connect it to another computer. If it's not encrypted, the contents of that drive will be readable.
And if they don't try, it's not a question of trying to pull the hard drive out. It's a question of simply somebody comes up to your laptop and figures out your password. It's not. They can access all those.
If they have your password, they would be able to access it, yeah.
So really, when we're talking about encryption, we're talking about actually trying to remove the hard drive. Are we also talking about when you try to download the, or transfer the content of a hard drive to another device?
Potentially. That would really be the data in transit. So anytime, say if you had data on your hard drive that maybe you were required to upload it to a network file share, that would be data in transit. If you're within the confines of your corporate network, you're protected, ideally, by the firewalls and various things you might have. If you're at home and you want to transfer it to your corporate network, then you need to make sure that data is transferred in an encrypted way. Now that could be your laptop has a VPN connection and you're tunneled back, we call it tunneling, you're tunneled back to your organization, and that transmission process is done securely. You wouldn't want to, as an example, you wouldn't want to attach it into your Gmail account and send it off, because encryption is not guaranteed in that scenario. Or you wouldn't want to transfer it via an insecure method like FTP or some of the older ways to do that.
Or thumb drive?
Definitely, I would be, thumb drives are bad ideas for many respects, but there are ways if you absolutely needed to use a thumb drive. On the Microsoft side, there's a thing called BitLocker to go, which is an extension of their built-in tool. When you plug in a drive, it'll say it's not encrypted, we can't write to it unless you encrypt it, and it asks you to kind of come up with this long password. And then once you do that, you can use it. If anybody picks it up off the street, it won't be readable unless they have your password. So there's some ways we can work with that. So encryption, it's one of these areas that the security of it is dependent on the compute power that's available to potentially break that encryption. Years ago, much weaker standards were acceptable because computing power is very weak. These days, and depending on the compute power available to a hacker, we have to go generally 256 bits or higher, and that's basically just the length of the key. 256 bits, I kind of throw a number out here, requires 3 to the 10th to the 51st power years at current computing power to break. Pretty good. Chances are, that won't be broken. Amazingly enough, though, every 10 years or so, that number is drastically reduced. So, again, if we're having this conversation 10 years from now, likely a lot of data on this slide will be different. And then there's an emerging field of quantum computing, which is still largely theoretical, but it would be an exponential increase in compute power, and it would break a lot of the standards that we have today.
Nick, can you talk about cost of encryption? Because a lot of our clients years ago used to be expensive to get laptops encrypted and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The price of that has dropped
absolutely
dramatically over the last few years. Want to just touch upon that?
Yeah. So there's encryption is essentially free today. Now I say that with a caveat. It really depends on the extent to which you want to take it and the features and the extra kind of bells and whistles. But essentially it's free. If you go to Best Buy or Amazon and buy a laptop, it will come with encryption software built in. It might not be turned on by default, but it'll be available. It'll be essentially free to utilize. Microsoft ships BitLocker now with Windows 10, I think all flavors, and that is, not only is it free, but it plays very well in corporate infrastructures. And by that I mean an individual user's key will be stored centrally. So if they forget their password, there's a way to restore access to that laptop so that drive isn't isolated. And similarly on the Mac side, if you do have Macs in your organization, those ship now with encryption on by default, and it's very robust encryption. So essentially, unless you need an advanced solution, it is freely available. Perimeter protection, I'll keep this one short, and really this is just, a lot of these things have been in place now for quite a while. The idea is you want to protect your organization in layers. So you want to have a firewall on the outside, you want to have spam filtering, attachment protection. You want to have sort of layers as you get closer to your data. There's intrusion prevention and detection systems that monitor, in some cases, the edge of the network, in some cases the internal bits of the network, but monitor for abnormal activity and evidence of compromise. Spam and malware filters will take the brunt of your spam activity and kind of isolate it, so the users aren't getting all these emails with malicious attachments. And then segmenting the network really just means isolating different areas. You could do it by functional teams, so maybe your finance team is in an isolated segment, HR is in an isolated segment. The average user can't get to those machines. It's another way to add, we call it defense in depth, another way to protect your network.
Yeah, just one thing, Nick, it's in professional services organizations such as law firms, it's a real issue of how much access the people in the law firm or organization should have to information in general. In bigger firms like multi-location firms, they've started saying that you only have access to your department's information. So you couldn't, if you were a litigator, you wouldn't have transactional access. You'd have to get that specifically. That gets back to your triad because, of course, that may mean a real hassle for somebody in the field, but on the other hand, it is something that protects the organization against somebody who's in one group and has malicious thoughts of getting access to something they're not supposed to get access to. The flip side is you do what you say, you wall off particular practices. Like a trust and estates practice, you would wall them off from general access, because otherwise everyone in the firm has access to Social Security numbers. Okay.
Operating system security is, we call it hardening. Basically, for a long time, Windows is actually fairly good now, but some of you may remember the early days of Windows 95, 98, 2000. Microsoft shipped, for whatever reason, they shipped all their machines with all services turned on by default. And the average user, especially outside of the corporate world, but the average user turns on a computer and gets to work. But for the IT departments and security departments in those days, it took days to turn everything off, to look through all available services and say, we don't need this, we don't need that. We call that hardening process. So basically, it's turning on only the minimum number of services that are needed just to conduct, daily business. So these days, Windows is pretty good, Macs are pretty good, but really, it's just disabling unnecessary services. There's some tips here, only allowing log on from assigned accounts so that you can't just have somebody walking down the hallway logging into machines. Just basic tips. And there's tools out there, there's websites that offer best practices. And there's actually files that you can download to plug into what we call group policy, which is a Microsoft architectural term. Basically, it allows you to administer all your computers using central configuration. And there's some best practices that you can pull down, some from Microsoft, some from third parties that configure automatically for you. So they basically install a best practices policy set. Patch management is one of the biggest areas of computer security that a lot of people overlook, or maybe it gets caught up with business requirements. And a lot of the hacks that we've seen, Yahoo had 2 breaches in 2016. I think one was about 500 million accounts compromised, and the other was over 1 billion accounts compromised. That's like 1/7 of the planet. And I think the second breach was largely due to unpatched computers. Now, patching is just really and we've all seen this message come up, but patching is just the application of a software update to your operating system, to third-party software like Adobe, Microsoft updates, what have you. These companies develop software and even hardware in some cases. In most cases, with security in mind, and these things come out, they're not perfect. So, a month later they might discover a bug, or in some cases that we have bug bounty programs where people make it their entire living to test software for bugs and report them to the vendor, and they can get paid, in some cases quite handsomely depending on the size of the bug. So these things are constantly being identified, and big organizations, Microsoft, IBM, Apple, have entire teams that are kind of triaging the information that comes in. They're doing software updates. They issue it on a regular basis. Microsoft has what we call Patch Tuesday. The second Tuesday of every month, they unload all their patches into the wild. In a lot of cases, very consistently, there are critical security patches that come out. They're usually in advance of vulnerabilities, but in some cases, there are what we call zero-day vulnerabilities where the public is made aware that software is vulnerable. Could be a firewall, could be a Windows server, could be a Windows desktop. But there's a critical vulnerability out there. We call it a zero-day, in that we're made aware of it, but we don't have a fix in hand yet, or the fix might be coming out just on the same day as the vulnerability. But patching is absolutely critical. One thing we get from our clients in a lot of cases is that typically the desktops are patched a bit more frequently, servers aren't. And that reason is, well, the business won't let us have any downtime. It goes back to availability. We need to be 24/7. We just don't have the bandwidth. We're not getting managerial approval. But the downside of that is, if you're not patching your servers, and we have clients that will go 6 months without updating any of their servers just because they can't make that case to management. And we try and help them with that by just pointing out, that if you let it go 6 months, there's probably 1,000 security-related vulnerabilities that might accumulate in that time, any one of which could be crippling to a business. So that alone should be reason enough to get, maybe it's 2 a.m. on a Saturday, but get some bandwidth to apply those updates. Many of the data breaches that we've seen over the last 10 years could have been prevented by a good patching program. Malware protection. So you have major software programs, antivirus programs like Symantec, Sophos, all these big programs. You probably have them on your computers. Only recently, the newest versions, Sophos is one, have started to include malware protection. Malware is different than computer viruses in a lot of ways. Computer viruses have been around a lot longer, and they operate in consistent, predictable ways. Malware is it's a broad category that the software in that category doesn't necessarily follow the same patterns of a traditional virus. And for a long time, antivirus applications didn't look for malware, couldn't identify it, didn't protect you against it. So there's new category, Malwarebytes is a software package that has been around for a few years that's excellent, and it's specifically tailor-focused to identify malware. You need to make sure that you're protected against both viruses and malware. Malware could be things like adware, not overly malicious, but it's installing ads, and you might get annoying pop-up ads. You're asking yourself, where did this come from? How is it here? it's benign. They're trying to sell some advertisements. It's not overly malicious. On the flip side of that is spyware. Where it's not a virus, but it's software that gets installed that's mining some aspect of your data. It could be very malicious in looking at what you have, on your network, looking for Word doc files, Excel files, and trying to get that out. But it's a broad category, and you need to make sure you're protected for both. One area that really applies to both antivirus and to malware that can help protect you is eliminating the use of local administrative rights. And that is, a lot of, I would say, maybe time-constrained IT departments might just give you local admin. That's the ability to install anything on your particular machine, and software. You can install printers, what have you. It's a bit of an act of laziness in that maybe the IT person doesn't have time to help you with that or troubleshoot exactly what it is. But the vast majority of cases of software infection can be prevented by eliminating that, because if you're a local admin on your machine, the software you're running is running under that local admin context. If you're not a local admin, if you have a restricted user account, the software that you're running, if it's running under your user context, is very limited, so it can't do as much. I think 80% or so of antivirus and malware infections can have their damage contained by eliminating this. I would say the number one area for all organizations is awareness and training. The show, The Weakest Link, it was on 10 years ago. It really, we don't like to say that employees are the weakest link, but they are, essentially. You can spend $10 million on the most sophisticated perimeter protection and log analysis tools, and you can put whatever the latest and greatest security is, but chances are one person clicking on one malicious attachment will bypass all of that security. You might be eliminating 90% of that from actually getting to the user, but it really just takes one click to have your network compromised. In almost every case of network compromise, of data breach, it was attributable back to one user clicking. It's not that you need 5 users, it's just that one user. So we really need to make people aware of what the common threats are, how people are getting hacked, what phishing is. Hackers are very lazy people, by and large. They're not inventing any of these technologies themselves. They're using what's out there. They're not trying to break into your firewall, which is a very sophisticated and complicated device, when they can send an email to somebody in your company saying, hey, this is Google, you need a password reset, here, download this file and it'll automatically, do whatever it needs. And somebody says, oh, wow, great, how convenient. They don't need to hack your firewall when they can do that. So really we need to train staff to be skeptical, to kind of slow down, to think before you click, be critical thinkers when this stuff comes in. One service offering that we have is phishing kind of testing and training. So we simulate phishing emails to your staff. So we'll basically send at least one email to everybody a week, and we call it kind of a slow drip campaign, where it looks, we have easy to identify ones all the way to very difficult to identify ones, and we'll track the results, who's clicking, who's not. If generally you find it's a more sophisticated base, that's good. But we dashboard all of this. We target what we call serial clickers, people who will just click on anything that comes in. We put them in a bucket and we focus the training on them. They get twice the amount of these training emails than everyone else does, maybe 3 times, depending on how much they're clicking. It's a proven method to kind of reduce this. I mean, it's a brute force method where they're just getting hit with this stuff, multiple times a day until they stop clicking. But in some cases, that we find that to be pretty effective than having everyone come into a room and somebody's up at the front talking about phishing, because then they're like, okay, I have work to do, I have to get back. So having it sort of, kind of get them at their desk is helpful. And we find, even though we know who these people are who are clicking, we find the carrot more effective than the stick. So bringing them in front of their manager and lecturing them isn't very effective. In some cases, what we've seen work is rewards, it could be a gift card, but the best performing, the person who didn't click on anything for a given year gets a gift card or gets some recognition. That tends to draw attention in a positive way. But really the most alarming statistic, this is taken from the Verizon data breach report, and they do a report every year on kind of the state of data breaches, but 23%, I think this is 2015's number, 23% of recipients of phishing emails open the message. That's bad enough. But 11% are clicking on the attachments. And when you consider it only takes one person to cause a data breach, that's kind of an alarming number. So kind of final thoughts here. This is a little cartoon. I don't know if you can read the caption in the back, but it's a gentleman standing up with a board of directors on his jacket, and there's a cybersecurity guy sitting at the kids' table, and the board member says, "We think it's time for you to come sit at the big kids' table." I thought this was kind of a cute way to demonstrate this, but organizations we're finding are finally taking cybersecurity seriously. It's only taken 15 years of devastating news headlines to have this happen, but they're starting to take it seriously. And with the passing of the mass data security law, 6 years in, we're starting to see some real interest here, and really a seat, for cybersecurity at the table. One final thought I'll leave you with regards to the mass law is the testing of safeguards. There's some ambiguity in how you approach the evaluating the effectiveness of the programs you've put in place. But if you look at the checklist that they've put out to help you get compliant, they ask whether or not you've tested your safeguards. And we take the interpretation, the advice we give to our clients is treat that as an audit. Audit your safeguards. You have to list out everything you're putting in place to protect PI. Treat it like an audit. Go through and test all those safeguards. If you're saying that all of your laptops are encrypted, sample 25% of your laptops and test all of them. Are they encrypted? You have to evaluate the effectiveness of the safeguards you put in place to protect PI.